in the discussion about Tantra and Bliss energy, we'll discuss this relationship of the male to the female in terms of the difference in the processing of the juices. The essential difference is that the electrical process which makes an egg has a lot more of the fractal unpacking quality, whereas clearly the process of making a seed at any plant level is very much a yang, a converging, a packing activity. And electrically that has a lot to do with the difference between the male and the female sex juices. Whereas it is frequently discussed that in the female there is literally a liquid ejaculant, whereas it's perhaps not as noted as in the male. But the fact is that even in the classical instructions of how you do this Merkaba, this tetrahedral fire breath meditation in sacred geometry, even from Jerusalem, as well as the Flower of Life, that the perfect way to approach this Merkaba meditation was to visualize the spin path into your mother's egg as a sequence of turns of the key turning points emotionally between now and when you were in your mother's egg, because that will steer you back in the spin path to the center of the tornado, because your mother's egg was present in her mother, which was fully formed in her mother, etc. So that it's so fractal that it would lead you back to the dimpling of the Big Bang, and it would give you a common point of reference with all others who were trying then at that same moment to access their center of ground, center of mothering, center of egg-ness, center of perfect fractality. So that would be a little bit of a clue to how you get a common point of reference based on how fractal is the egg, whereas the seed, for example, is an experiment in departing from embedding. It's like experimenting with how separate it can make. So the male often can experiment with separateness with a lot more agony than a female. And so a male will often go out on a limb in terms of ideas, whereas a female is much more likely to be grounded in the land and embedded. And so ultimately, in the sense of immortality, the egg is already immortal because it's already fractal, whereas the seed is totally at risk. And unless it finds a perfectly fractal egg, the seed knows that its genetic material is essentially toast. And that is expressed in very interesting ways in the way tantric process toward bliss is different between the male and the female. That I have known women, for example, who can feel very electrically orgasmic just sitting on the earth and feeling their glands touching the earth. Or it is another way to understand this. Here's a good example. The taboo against allowing women to bleed menstrually in a sweat lodge, because the woman's menstrual blood leaks this fractality and creates such an electrically lightning path into ground that the male shaman could not help but be sucked in. Whereas the I call it the Orion Queen energy working friends of Barbara Marciniak travel to these Draco sacred sites, even the Dome of the Rock, and they pour menstrual blood, which is a lot more electrically the claiming of one's space than for a male it would be to urinate on the corners of the kingdom, because the electrical nature of the grounding of the menstrual blood is so embedding that it allows one to inhabit the space magnetically. So as we were discussing in the intermission here, what have we learned about the approach to Tantra? Well, let's try to translate this into practical, juicy, and appropriate ways to increase the sexual voltage. The fact is, first of all, the DNA knows when there's a bliss potential. So the first instructions to true Tantra is to listen to your inner voice, listen to your DNA when it tingles, to understand that that's where the attraction lies, because that's where the voltage of conjugation could be maximized. That's where you get this phase conjugate optics because two opposing laser beams annihilate each other, or in Bennett's book in the Gurdjieff tradition on sexuality, that that if the partners are not of equal and opposite voltage, that one experiences a short and the other experiences a ground, and unconsciously they will sabotage the relationship. So the only thing that works is if the voltage, if the tension, if the fire of the opposing couple is equal, which is why it's such a miracle to find someone that really sort of is the perfect balance, because in that perfect balance, only in the spark gap that's perfectly electrical balanced can the square wave then stand still, and in the square wave of the perfect spark gap is a container or grail cup or chalice that in that moment of stillness can catch as many waves capacitively of all the different stars at once. So it's how you incarnate Avatar, because the star waves of charge is the body of star beings or angels. Another excellent way to visualize this is to understand why eagles copulate in 0G. I think this was a Victor Schauberger story, but if you look at the arc angle of eagles approaching in the ritual dance of of copulation for eagles, they approach from opposite directions and they enter this perfect sculpted sort of elements of the spiral on a vortex spin path till they touch, and then they grab talons and they spin in a perfect double helix in 0G for the moment of copulation. And the result of that is the eagle's eye contains the maximum horizon of vision, which is the maximum focus, which is the maximum aligning of waves in the entire food chain. So to be consumed in perspective, one needs to reach that still point in that perfect spiral spin path to the 0 point. I guess the romance, as it were, is that we're given enough voltage in our DNA to squirt ourselves into stars, generally only if we see it in the mirror of relationship. And in relationship to others, we yearn for this place where the spark gap of conjugal relations, phase conjugation, creates this perfect chalice or container or grail cup within which can incarnate the body of stars. Bodiness is how long the wave that can be caught in the cup. So in that still point moment of perfect tantra, there is that moment when you can feel the stars as if they're your own body. And this was what was meant by Magdalene's tantric swoon. So in this spin path of the way in which charge inhabits the body, we want to finish with a little description about how to apply this in hygiene and lifestyle in general. And I'd like to use the example about how to eat spin, which is really the theme of the story, from how when you take a bite out of a whole apple, you feel a tingle in your cheek. You feel a kind of, there's a little splash in that moment of charge. Whereas if you took that, hi kitty, if you took that whole apple and you cut it up using a knife, and then you ate the tiny little pieces, you don't feel nearly as much tingle. So this helps us to understand what you lose when you chop food up. What you lose is essentially what we call